April 30th, 1943, Camp Atterbury, Indiana. The convoy arrives the way thunder arrives on a flat plain, heard first, then felt underfoot. Canvas-topped GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks downshift and sigh, engines ticking as radiators breathe off the day. Dust hangs in floodlights over a chalked diamond, white lines bright as bone. Corporal Joe Ramirez, MP and former Sandlot shortstop, tests the weight of a fresh ball, the horsehide smooth and slightly oily from the factory. On the other side of the wire, Sergente Vittorio Bellini stops because the guards are laughing. He had been trained to expect clubs and chains. He gets a rulebook and a backstop instead, a game beginning while the horizon is still the colour of coals. The intake line shuffles past delousing and inventory. A medical sergeant snaps thermometers and notes inoculations. A clerk types names with 2 fingers. A bag of personal effects thumps into a crate. Vittorio watches a truck idle, its inline-6 270 cubic-inch engine steady as a church organ. He notes the towers at each corner with phones strung between them, floodlights turning dusk into doctrine. A YMCA crate rolls by stamped athletics. A guard opens it with a screwdriver, not a weapon. Bats in tissue, balls in waxed dozens, gloves stiff as new boots. Joe checks a rulebook, dog-eared from rain. He will brief new MPs on Geneva requirements after the game, mess schedules, pay chits, grievance forms, searchlight rules, warning shots. He plucks his cap lower and trots to short, spikes biting the dirt. Coffee rides the air from the mess. Coal oil from the generator plant hums under the arcs of light. The diamond is squared like an inspection. Bases are staked, the backstop welded from scrap, the scoreboard hand-lettered by an ordnance corporal who can draw straight with either hand. A private in the on-deck circle talks about a sister who sends him licorice every month, regular as payroll. On the fence path, Italians move as one organism, thin, sunburnt, eyes trying not to look, failing. Vittorio has the gait of a mason's son and the memory of a Tunisian dust storm that felt permanent. He hears English he half understands and a sound he does not need language to pass. The clean pop of leather receiving a fastball. He has known drills in boots with cardboard heels, grenades issued by the handful, fuel by rumour. Here he watches an American private toss a scuffed ball aside because somebody has already called "got another." A grounder slices foul and rolls under the lowest strand. The nearest Italian stoops and holds it, uncertain. Joe jogs over and says, "Grazie," learned from Sister Mary Columba at the parish tent. The prisoner hands it through with 2 fingers as if returning a relic. Joe tosses it to the ump and taps his glove twice. The crowd of motor pool men and laundry clerks claps, and a boy on a bicycle rings his bell at every strike, a tinny metronome for order. In Vittorio's head, a ledger begins forming without his consent. Trucks by the dozen, gloves by the dozen, meals by the day. He smells boiled coffee and onions from the canteen wagons. He sees a sergeant hold the rulebook like a code. He understands almost nothing and everything. This game is not softness, it is system. The United States has time for it, light for it, leather for it, and a form to replace every piece when it wears out. Back home, time is borrowed. Here, time is scheduled and delivered. When the pitcher finally comes set, the field stills like a held breath. Joe shades 2 steps towards second, glove low, reading the hitter's hands. The generator tone deepens as another bank of lights clicks on. Someone has chosen to burn that fuel for this moment. The pitch rides high, the bat lifts, a long parabola climbs into the Indiana dark, hangs and drops like a slow decision. Joe takes it on the short hop and fires. The out blooms at first with a thud you can feel in your teeth. Night thickens and mosquitoes sing suicide songs in the arcs. The scoreboard flips, one number replacing another with the inevitability of a train schedule. Joe grins without meaning to. Vittorio does the same and catches himself. The tower guard shifts his rifle and watches the lines hold. Somewhere in the admin office, a teletype jitters, listing inbound cargo, food, fuel, medicine, and a thin column few will notice labelled athletic. A dozen balls here, a dozen there, another bulb, another crate of chalk. Vittorio leans back from the wire and feels, against everything he had been told, the first small draught of certainty collapse. The guards play on. The lights hold. The trains will arrive again tomorrow, and the diamond will be raked smooth before Reveille. Sunday brings a different cadence, not softer, just tuned to mercy. The chapel tent breathes like a lung in the prairie breeze, guy lines humming, canvas smelling faintly of soap and dust. Sister Mary Columba steps down from a Red Cross truck balancing hymnals and a box of scuffed practice balls donated by the post team. She wears a crucifix polished by 1,000 thumbprints. The MPs snap a courteous "ma'am." Across right field, the guard company drills, rifles at port arms moving like the pendulum of a big clock. She reads the week's order to a line of young MPs who would rather be batting clean-up. Geneva is not a slogan, she says, calm as a clinic. It's table of organisation for how you hold a man without losing your own soul. Joe Ramirez, cap tucked in his belt, nods along and picks up the refrain when the lieutenant arrives. Mess times printed and posted. Complaint box checked nightly. Searchlights swept through prescribed arcs. Warning shots measured by rule, not mood. He has the rulebook in his pocket the way a corporal carries a pocket Bible. Through open flaps, the outfield shows like a stained glass panel, white chalk, trampled grass, benches mended with parachute cord. The generator's tone deepens as a mechanic tests load. Sister sets the hymnals on a crate and opens the box of balls. The smell rises, leather, shellac, the faint tang of twine. Waste of good gloves, a corporal jokes, but he is smiling. Investment in order, she replies, and in tomorrow's work. She has learned that on nights with games, the compound sleeps and the morning details form on time, voices lower, fists unclenched. Vittorio shaves at a barrel mirror with a borrowed blade that would have seen better days even in peacetime. The water is tepid, the towel is coarse and clean. He is adjusting to that paradox. Clean. He has a bunk, a blanket, a number. He has seen guards read the bulletin aloud with the same solemnity they give to morning reports. He knows now the canteen will hold cigarettes, chocolate and soap again tomorrow because the depot sends them like sunrise. He has heard it said that the Americans have millions of trucks. He cannot count millions. He can count tonight's 4 that keep circling like patient metal shepherds. That afternoon, a ball skips the gravel and dies against the wire. A few Italians gather, pretending indifference. A young private jogs over and kneels to reach it under the lowest run, palm open. Vittorio's hand meets his for a second across the bottom edge of the world. "Grazie," the private says with a crooked grin, and then in English, "Thank you." Vittorio's mouth finds the reply almost without permission. He had been told these men were mechanical and cruel. He had not been told they would say please and thank you like men whose strength is so certain they can spare courtesy. After Vespers, Sister walks the fence with a chaplain. They talk duty and boredom, which is the tyrant of every camp. She tells him that boredom is a battle drill too. Fill the hours with routine and men will keep their shape. The chaplain watches the sunset burn a stripe along the baseline. "Looks like a runway," he says. "For what?" she asks. "For a country," he says, surprising himself. The generator stutters, then steadies. Someone has swapped a worn belt for a fresh one drawn from the parts bin like bread from an oven. Night settles clean. The game is crisp, small errors corrected in quiet. Joe takes grounders and looks once to the fence line, where faces watch in the bright. He thinks of his mother's kitchen in South Chicago and the way she clicked the gas on, flame sure every time. He has come to believe the diamond is the same promise in another register. We will light this, we will feed this, we will do it again tomorrow. He will tell his rookies that Geneva is not about kindness. It is about predictability, so absolute that kindness can breathe inside it. When the last hymn fades and the last out thumps into leather, Sister counts the balls back into the crate and marks a chit for the lending. The corporal who joked earlier signs as if he is requisitioning spark plugs. Joe salutes her with 2 fingers and says, "Ma'am, thank you for the loan." Vittorio, on his side of the fence, tucks a scrap of ruled paper into his pocket for a letter home. He will write that there is coffee every day, and that there are games under lamps bright enough to read by. He will add that the guards carry themselves like men certain of tomorrow. He will not write that he felt safer when the backstop glowed than he had felt behind sandbags in Tunisia, but he will think it. Beyond the fence, the trucks cough to life and roll toward the motor pool, a procession. In the chapel tent, Sister closes the ledger and taps the crate, steps into the night air that smells of oil and bread. A week after arrival, the weather turns and the horizon sharpens as if the prairie has been honed on a whetstone. Freight whistles stitch the day. Vittorio carries crates in a work detail under guard to the quartermaster shed and meets Sergeant Mac McPherson, a man with ledger eyes and hands like end wrenches. Mac has the patient air of someone who believes paper and planning beat chaos. He shows the Italians where to stack canvas, where to stow chalk, where to sign the lending log, his pencil clicking in a rhythm the depot understands. Mac does not evangelize, he inventories. 2 dozen new, he says, tapping a sealed box. 12 used, practice, 3 cracked, discard. He moves like a metronome. Joe stops by in passing and jokes that the only thing Mac loves more than a requisition is a bedtime story about one. Mac shrugs. Nothing runs out if you respect the schedule, he says, almost a prayer. Vittorio files the sentence beside other recent astonishments. Coffee 3 times a day, bread that tastes of yeast instead of fear, a library shelf that refills as if the books bloom. The guard tower phones ring once, distant and punctual as a test. Vittorio notes the ordinary miracle. A post can wire its own perimeter so thoroughly that an alarm moves faster than a rumour. He remembers how, in Tunisia, messages rode boot leather and hope. Here a corporal can lift a handset and reach 4 corners without raising his voice. Outside, a GMC CCKW grinds by. 2.5 tons of proof that wheels replace hooves when a nation buys them by the million. The driver waves. Vittorio waves back before his pride can object. Mac lets him pin a page to the corkboard. Italy has artisans, Vittorio says in halting English, tapping the scrap with the chapel sketch he is planning. We can make beautiful. Mac nods. Do it, he says. I'll find lime and nails. The transaction contains a quiet thesis. The prisoner asks to build, the sergeant finances the future. Sister stops in with a parish basket, soap, paper, a few apples, and reads a line from a letter. A boy in town wants to learn the Italian word for fastball. Vittorio writes it on the box. Palla veloce. The day's work ends with a ritual that would have seemed obscene a month ago. Mac opens a fresh crate of baseballs and rolls one across his palm as if it were a coin. Regulation, he says, ticking off the details more to himself than to the room. Cork and rubber core, layers of wound yarn, cowhide in 2 pieces, 108 hand-sewn stitches. He initials the ledger and sets 3 aside for the post team, as if setting aside blank checks. Vittorio blinks. In his army, a dented can was treasure. Here, a scuffed ball is practice. That night, the wind comes up smelling of rain. Joe plays infield in air so clean it tastes metallic. A runner takes out his legs at second, and both men pop up grinning, the language of rules requiring no translation. The crowd is small, guard wives, motor pool men, a few townsfolk, but a boy with a bicycle bell keeps exact count of strikes. Sister sits near the backstop with a notebook, recording loans and returns. She writes that the game has trimmed 2 arguments over the last month and cut a fight short the previous Sunday. Order accrues interest. Then Mac lays out the chart that tilts the world. He slides a single sheet from a folder and pins it by the duty roster. Throughput, he says. Columns fill with numbers that read like fiction until you smell the oil on the paper. Rations by the ton per week, tyres by the 100, bulbs and chalk by the crate. And there, in the margins, a note he underlines. Willow Run, the Ford plant in Michigan. At peak turns out one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, an airplane an hour flying off a single line. Vittorio stares, as if the line might be a trick. Mac taps the pencil again. Hundreds of thousands of American aircraft across the war, millions of trucks, artillery by the 100,000. Ships slide down ways like coins. He does not say the conclusions. Vittorio understands that if a nation can build a heavy bomber faster than an infantry company can form for roll call, it can afford to play baseball at dusk and still make war until dawn is spent. He walks back to the compound with the chapel sketch in his pocket and a new weight in his chest. The wind has shifted. The floodlights throw long shadows through the wire and paint the ground with light in a pattern like stained glass. He thinks of the rulebook, the coffee, the ledger, the backstop, the boy with a bell. He thinks, unwilling but unable not to, that the first certainty to break may be his own. The guard in the tower yawns. The phone rings once, on time. Somewhere, another page is pinned to another board. September 8th, 1943 arrives in Indiana as a rumour first. The Italians have signed something, and then as a bulletin read with gravity. The radio's voice is flat, but the silence that follows is not. The compound becomes a room where someone has just told a truth, and no one knows what to do. Vittorio looks at the faces around him and sees a dozen different wars take root behind the eyes. Joe Ramirez, walking the fence with a clipboard in hand, hears the news twice. Once on the air, once in the sudden tidiness with which men straighten their blankets. The colonel's order group gathers in the admin hut. Doctrine becomes procedure in minutes. The staff prints a notice. Prisoners may volunteer for Italian service units. Labour only, no combat. Distinctive insignia. Pay chits continue. Joe is assigned to escort a detail to the depot if volunteers appear. Sister Mary Columba writes a note to the parish board explaining the change in one sentence that feels larger than paper can hold. Some of the men behind the fence are now, in some narrow and necessary way, on our side. Vittorio sits on his bunk with the chapel sketch on his knee and a choice that seems to erase the floor under him. He thinks of his father's trowel, of boots that never fit, of Mac's ledger and the clean arithmetic of chalk. He thinks of letters home and the way his mother would tilt them to catch the light. One of the hardliners on the next bunk mutters that those who sign up will wear American collars and eat American shame. Vittorio holds his breath until the line of his own thoughts emerges like a path in fog. At the depot, where the world's heartbeat is measured in couplings and whistles, Joe walks a dozen new ISU volunteers through the safety brief. Do not cross a track without a hand sign. Do not ride a forklift. Do not pocket the nails, no matter how much you love nails. Mac waves from the dock with a pencil behind his ear and a grin he does not try to hide. Good choice, he tells no one in particular. Crates move. Vittorio learns to listen for the small scrap of metal that means a brake shoe has kissed a wheel. That evening the post team lacks an umpire. The regular is laid up with strep. Someone points towards the compound. Joe cocks an eyebrow at the lieutenant, who shrugs like a man who trusts rules. Joe asks the sergeant of the guard for 2 minutes and then approaches the fence with the casualness of a man who knows the weight of decisions. Vittorio, he says, picking one face among many because he remembers the ledger eyes. You call soccer fair. You can call this fair the gate opens on hinges that do not squeal. It would have been unthinkable a month before. It is merely new tonight. Vittorio steps onto the grass, knuckles white around the borrowed mask, and the world tilts. The crowd is careful. Joe explains the signals twice, then once more, and assigns a bilingual private to murmur translations. Sister sits a few rows back with a parish boy who keeps whispering the Italian word for fastball like a spell under his breath. Quando, veloce, palla. The floodlights make moths fall in slow spirals, a snow of wings. In the third, a close play at second goes Vittorio's way. The runner pops up hot. The infield gathers. The air pauses. Joe raises his hands and says, "My ump, my call," adding a wordless period with the angle of his shoulders. The runner's anger drains under rules applied cleanly. The game breathes again. From the bleachers comes that bicycle bell, a child's bright insistence that order is possible. Vittorio feels something settle inside him, a plumb line finding centre. Back in the barracks, the hardliner at the next bunk watches him return with the mask in hand. "So," the man says, "you wear their collar." Vittorio looks at the tin cup on his shelf, at the scuffed ball he has been allowed to keep for chapel decoration once it's too soft to use, at the folded sketch, at the ledger lines he saw on Mac's board that afternoon, at the generators that kept the field as bright as a Sunday noon, and he answers in a voice that sounds like a man telling himself the truth. "I will build what I can." Outside, radios murmur in two languages, a freight horn marking the hour. Joe hangs the borrowed mask by the dugout and logs the game in tidy block letters. Sister walks past the dark diamond and touches the backstop like holy water. Tomorrow there will be more forms to sign, more pallets to move, more innings to call, the same lights waiting on a switch. The quartermaster sheds smells like solvent and oiled canvas, the kind of honest stink that says the machine will start when asked. Boxes line the racks in the grammar of supply, item, quantity, reorder point. Sergeant Mac McPherson has penciled each shelf with block letters that face the aisle like soldiers at inspection. Vittorio carries a crate of chalk to the counter, still puzzling over the American talent for making predictability feel like mercy. Mac signs the chit, flips it for carbon, and taps a thin column on the wall chart. "Inventory is strategy," he says. "A light bulb is a plan." Down the rows run numbers like quiet rivers, rations by the ton per week, gasoline by the drum, spark plugs by the 100, paper by the ream. At the far right, bats, gloves, chalk, floodlight bulbs, scorebooks, no fanfare, just cadence. Sister Mary Columba arrives with a parish boy and a long brown paper parcel stamped Louisville. Inside is a bat white as bone, grain straight, stamp crisp. The boy rehearses "Palla veloce" until it fits in his mouth without tripping. Mac weighs the bat on a postal scale and writes the ounce count in the lending log because he weighs everything. Vittorio laughs at the absurdity and then at the rightness. What is measured belongs to tomorrow. Joe Ramirez shows up in the doorway with dust on his cuffs and the easy fatigue of a shift that went right. "Bulb figure?" he asks. Mac doesn't check. "Enough hours at current burn rate to play every night through summer twice, reserves in depot. Not a boast, plumbing." Mac slides another sheet across the counter. "Plant production highlights." The lines roar. Willow Run at peak turns out a B-24 Liberator roughly every 63 minutes, an airplane an hour, a winged building rolling off a line that taught itself perfection by repetition. One factory, one roof, and more aircraft than some nations will ever touch. Elsewhere, trucks counted in the millions, artillery by the 100,000, a home front that makes spares before failure can learn its own name. Vittorio's old reflex stands up to argue and sits down again without speaking. "What if a shipment is late?" he asks anyway. "The reserve covers it," Mac says. "And if the reserve fails?" "Then the plan was wrong, and we correct the plan." No drama in his tone, which is the drama. In Vittorio's army, failure meant improvisation with pride glued to it like a medal. In this army, failure means a form changes and the next train arrives on time. They walk the shelves. Mac lets Vittorio initial the slip for 3 practice balls destined for the compound's awkward baseball clinic. "You'll ruin them on gravel," Joe grins. "We'll order more," Mac answers, and Vittorio feels the sentence take root as a structural truth. Americans solve wear by manufacturing time. A private at the back door uncrates bulbs with a care that looks like love and stacks them by date, newest to the rear, because the first in should be the first out. Sister watches like a catechist. The faith here is schedule, and schedule keeps men from breaking. Late light swings through high windows like a pendulum. A freight horn blows from the yard, a factory exhaling. Vittorio remembers Tunisia, where messages arrived on boots, where trucks were rumour. Here, tower phones ring once, punctual as pulse. A corporal can speak to 4 corners without raising his voice. It dawns on him that his first shock at the Diamond wasn't kindness, but design. Leisure arranged precisely as a proof of capacity. If a nation can plan a pastime to the minute, what has it planned for war? At evening formation, Joe briefs new MPs with a rulebook folded like a benediction. Warning shots, arcs of fire, complaint procedures, lights out at 2200 unless the game runs, then 22:15 by order of the day. They chuckle at the last line because it's funny to see joy codified and because it's terrifying to realise joy has a requisition number. Vittorio carries the 3 balls back to the compound like he's carrying evidence. Through the wire, he watches the field groomed by a drag that raises the softest dust, an artisan's veil. When the generator pitch deepens and the lights come alive, he understands that these lamps are not indulgence but doctrine, proof that tomorrow has already been paid for, proof that the enemy's calendar has lost authority. He sets the balls on a shelf beside his chapel sketch and, for the first time since capture, sleeps without listening for an argument in the dark. Texas arrives as sky, the kind that makes a man feel smaller and then steadier. Transfer orders clap the bulletin board, and by June 1944 the work detachment rides south in an olive-drab migration. Camp Hereford waits in the panhandle where the land pretends to be ocean. Dust tastes like a penny and never tires. Joe checks his roster. Temporary duty, Hereford. Sister folds chapel linens into a crate and tapes the corners like a woman binding up a wound. Vittorio steps down into light that makes everything honest. Hereford repeats Atterbury's grammar with a drawl. Corner towers wired by telephone loops. Floodlights in steel cages. A switchboard in a hut that smells of pencil wood and cigarettes. The officers' compound sports a tennis court chalked so bright the sun seems to have paused there longer. Within the Italian compounds, soccer goals bloom and string marks out a chapel footprint, stakes tapped into red clay. Mac rides in a CCKW jump seat, inspects belts on the generator, pats an air filter like a horse. "Wind'll eat these faster," he says, and has already raised the reorder point because he studied weather charts on the way. The first day is orientation in the wind's new language. A detail drags a scarifier across a rectangle of earth until it claims the name of Baseball Diamond. Joe watches from the gate, hands on hips, shortstop's geometry in his stance. Red dirt plays fast. He adjusts. Vittorio mixes stucco with chicken wire, trowels singing as if the panhandle keeps time. Sister grinds pigments from soil and berries and paints a small fresco, a hand holding a loaf. The loaf looks suspiciously like a twine-cord, leather-skinned ball. "You're smuggling baseball into sacred art," Joe teases. She smiles. "It got in my pockets," she says, and keeps painting. Attempts to teach American football sputter. Too much armour, too many collisions, logic buried under helmets. Baseball's grammar crosses the fence better. A ball, a bat, 90 feet enforced by the humiliation of running, 3 strikes, 4 balls, law declared in numbers. Joe runs a clinic near the wire. A bilingual private narrates. Vittorio tries a swing and discovers the sweet spot lives where patience meets violence. When the bat rings, the sound is chapel bell and hammer both. Security is lattice, not wall. Patrol patterns change by clock, not mood. Siren test at 1,000 each Wednesday. By the second blast, the Italians stop their soccer match without being told. Order demonstrated becomes habit. Habit becomes peace. The wind teaches other lessons. Keep your canteen capped. Cover the chalk. Breathe through your nose if you want to taste less iron. Joe issues dust masks as equipment, not fashion, and drills his MPs in hand signals at distances the wind steals. The first true night game tastes of corn and metal. The lights rise like a second moon, moths panic and then make their strange covenant with brightness. The infield plays quick and mean, demanding honest hands. Townsfolk drift to the fence, a barber in his white jacket, two girls sharing a paper sack of peanuts, a boy with a bicycle bell and priestly focus. Sister stands with a parish family and a radio that can catch a game 2 states away, thin but steady, a wire stretched across a continent. Mac counts pitches because he counts everything. Vittorio umpires with a new calm. Rules do not care about rank, and everyone behaves better under an authority nobody owns. A foul tip smacks his mask and turns the world to coins for a breath. He resets the count with fingers and sees men obey numbers without rancour. Joe shades double play depth and makes the pivot like a craftsman, not a hero. The panhandle wind presses shirts flat and steals sweat like a thief with decent manners. When the last out lands, the sound is clean and entire, as if a jar had closed. The crowd trickles away, the floodlights hum a last contented note, and the chapel wall glows faintly with dust pigment, the loaf's curve echoing the ball in Vittorio's hand. He thinks of Atterbury's rulebook, of Willow Run's bomber an hour, of Mac's changed reorder point that outran the wind before the wind knew it was hungry. In the dark between towers, he understands that the diamond is not a favour, but a forecast. Tomorrow will be bright because someone requisitioned it into being. By July, the system hums. Generator true, ledger true. Italian service units hit their stride. Mornings unload ration crates and brake shoes. Afternoons unbox waxed dozens of practice balls that smell like promise. Joe reviews his incident log and finds the pattern sergeants love. Nights with ball games yield quieter barracks, earlier lights out, fewer grievances that begin with nothing and end in bruises. Sister tallies similar graces in her notebook, fewer clinic visits for fistcuts, more for blisters earned respectfully. The depot's punctuality has a scent, diesel and sawdust, and a sound, steel kissing buffers. Boxcars ease into place like big animals setting down paws. Mac paces with clipboard and silence. Arithmetic preaches itself. A manifest lists rations by the ton and 2 lines lower, chalk by the crate. He files both under the same doctrine. Men stabilized by rituals consume fewer resources, fixing whatever anger breaks. He shifts athletic supplies from bi-weekly to weekly for a month and tracks incident rates, work output, maintenance delays. A small increase in recreation gear buys a measurable drop in breakage and lost hours. In the margin he writes, "Morale is a lubricant and does not submit the line, keeping it instead the way a man keeps a prayer under his breath." Afternoons, Sister runs a skills swap in the shade of the bleachers. A guard teaches an Italian to adjust a carburetor. An Italian shows a guard how to float plaster to glass. A bilingual private reads the strike zone aloud like scripture. A boy from town tests umpire in Italian and laughs. Vittorio referees a soccer match that ends with both teams drifting toward the diamond to watch infield practice, 2 games recognizing kinship. The wind noses around like a curious dog, rearranging dust into fine veils that settle on everything and make it all look equal. Radio voices bring the impossible numbers like weather reports. A commentator notes a single American plant turned out a heavy bomber nearly every hour at peak. Others remind listeners that US factories have lifted hundreds of thousands of aircraft into the world and bought trucks by the millions. Vittorio stops arguing with himself. He's seen bulbs arrive before the last case is half gone. He's watched Mac raise an air filter reorder point because Texas eats filters like bread. When order outruns entropy, the contest is no longer fair. Joe drills his MPs on posture and tone, the quiet arts. Geneva isn't softness, he tells them. It's discipline so strict that mercy fits inside it. He points at the diamond. That is one of my posts. On the hut wall, the night game schedule is thumbtacked beside the table of organisation like a paired diagram of war and peace. The men nod because they can feel the truth in their boots. It's easier to guard men who have something to watch, to anticipate, to talk about tomorrow. Evenings, Vittorio umpires under lights that make red dust into confetti. He has learned the strike zone to the width of a trowel and values consistency over favour. When a play goes sideways, Joe steps once toward the baseline, Universal Sergeant Semaphore, and tempers cool without speeches. The bicycle bell counts, strikes with ridiculous dignity. In the compound across the wire, men ease toward sleep as if pulled by a tide. Mid-month, a black storm walks in, tall as a courthouse. Generator crews check belts and brushes. The floodlights do not blink. Rain quickens the infield and puts metal on the tongue. The game finishes at a trot, chalk washed to a pale ghost. Italians sit listening to water mutter against tin. Many think of rivers by other names. Vittorio writes beside a bare bulb. America can afford to be gentle because it plans like a fortress. At month's end, Sister totals her ledger. Mac posts his chart. Joe updates his log. 3 documents, 1 story. This is how healthy armies speak. Private, sergeant, civilian, agree without rehearsal. Vittorio paints a border around the fresco loaf in the chapel with red earth pigment. He does not know that men will return decades later to photograph this wall. He only knows the line needs closing to keep the picture true. When he caps the jar, the generator sighs down, and the diamond goes dark on schedule, proof that even night takes orders here. The convoy forms at dawn like a sentence that knows where it's going. Joe rides shotgun in the lead CCKW, radio headset crooked over his cap, logbook ruled so straight it could cut. Behind him, 2.5 tons idle polite as draft horses, each with a spare cinched like a belt. Vittorio rides third truck, part of an Italian service unit detail assigned to tyre reclamation and light maintenance. Mac waits at the yard with a clipboard and the air of a man who has already solved 3 problems nobody else knows are coming. Road dust filters through canvas and leaves a dry line on every tongue. At the scheduled halt, a corporal drops a wheel with the speed of a pit crew. Joe times it with his wristwatch and notes the change. Standards breed speed, speed breeds safety. The line pulls out with a hiss, commas turning into clauses. At the depot, Vittorio learns tread depth, ply rating, and the priesthood of vulcanizing, heat and pressure laying new life on old bones. On the wall, a chart shows mean miles between failures and the convoy spacing that keeps a column elastic instead of brittle. Everything here has a number and a tolerance. Even mercy does. It's written as water break minutes in schedules and as the slack Joe insists on between trucks so the clumsy can learn without killing the careful. At the athletic dock, crates stamped athletic arrive with the same paperwork as brake shoes. Mac smiles, barely. Same war. Vittorio helps load pallets of balls, gloves, chalk, scorebooks with the care reserved for ammunition. He understands now that a scuffed ball traded across a fence buys an hour of quiet 2 nights later. The economy is not sentimental. It is efficient. Sister shows up with 2 parish boys and teaches them to coil rope properly. One asks whether baseballs ever run out. Not if Mac breathes, Joe says. Radio news drifts through the yard with the smell of hot tar, shipyards launching hulls at a weekly rate that outpaces entire fleets, stamping plants pressing more steel in a day than certain enemies refine in a month. Joe doesn't argue. He has seen bulbs arrive before the last case is half gone. Vittorio doesn't argue either. He has watched Mac raise the reorder point on filters because panhandle wind eats them like wheat. When the line of trucks becomes a school of fish and the depot a patient heart, the war's geography changes. Front lines exist in ledgers as much as on maps. They break for chow in the shade made by trucks themselves. Coffee is strong, stew honest. An MP reads about Willow Run's bomber an hour aloud from a magazine. Vittorio chews and imagines a factory as a chapel with moving pews, a liturgy of talk. He realises the statistic is not a headline. It is a weather report. You don't beat weather. You live by it or you drown. On the return leg, a truck stutters. The driver's hand goes up. The column ripples to the shoulder without panic. Vittorio passes spanners. Grease finds his knuckles in familiar ways. Mac arrives in the utility truck, asks for symptoms like a doctor, swaps a bad condenser in 3 minutes, pockets the corpse for autopsy, signs the tag, and waves them on. The line knits without drama because the space Joe insisted on has already purchased safety. Vittorio adds a private note to his mental catechism. American mercy often looks like distance measured correctly. They pass the diamond at dusk, and lights rise with theatrical timing no theatre could afford. Sisters' choir practices a hymn that floats above left field like a flag learning to sing. Numbers click on the scoreboard as if demonstrating reincarnation. Joe files his convoy log and laces spikes. Vittorio washes his hands in gasoline and water, dons the mask, settles into the squat that makes him invisible and responsible. Mac leans against the fence with a ledger in his pocket and the fixed conviction that nothing runs out tonight. Under moths and Texas stars, the first pitch cuts a line through air and time, and the crowd exhales together, a single engine settling into the right RPM. The night announces itself with light. Not sunset, but floodlights beating back the dark in a white geometry that makes even dust look deliberate. Late summer 1944 at Hereford, the field becomes a stage more exacting than any court-martial. Vittorio tightens the borrowed umpire's mask until the world narrows to a rectangle and a rule. Joe scuffs his spikes at short, testing the hinge in his hips the way a mechanic checks a belt. Feel before failure. Sister settles near the backstop with a parish radio and 2 boys who whisper Palavaloch as if the syllables themselves could call a strike out of the air. Beyond the fence, a local barber in a white jacket shares peanuts with a girl in a red skirt. A boy with a bicycle bell guards silence like a sacristan. He rings only for strikes, because even a child knows rules are holy when they are few and kept. Wind comes clean off the prairie, ironing jerseys flat, slipping red grit between tongue and teeth until everyone tastes the country itself. Joe flashes 2 fingers to shade for a pull hitter. Vittorio checks his stance and taps the mask's wire, feeling its modest armour become a promise he must keep. The pitcher sets. The first pitch splits the plate like a fulcrum. Sound arrives in 3 beats. Ball on air, ball on bat, ball in leather, each as distinct as a church door closing. Men on both sides breathe easier. Rhythm is a scaffold. In the second, a high hopper eats Joe's wrist, and he still turns it, pivot clean, throw true, dust spooling behind like ribbon from a factory floor. The runner pops up hot. Vittorio steps forward and says, English first, then Italian. Safe by anger would break the field. Out by rule keeps it whole. The player nods, heat cooling into obedience. Between frames, the radio coughs statistics that sound like tall tales until you stack them against the light above your head. 1 plant, the announcer says, once turned out a B-24 Liberator roughly every hour at peak, an airplane an hour, a flying building rolling off a line like bread from an oven. An hour. Mac doesn't look up. He has already carved the truth into his expectations. He notes bulb life against dust load, writes a new cleaning cadence, another quiet victory of schedule over entropy. Vittorio receives the number like weather. You don't argue with weather. You shelter under it, or it carries you away. In the 4th, a close play at the plate breaks the crowd's composure. The tag is a swipe, the slide a cloud, the decision invisible for a heartbeat and then permanent. Vittorio lifts his palms and calls the runner out. The benches creak. A heckle lifts and dies when Joe puts a hand on the catcher's shoulder with the authority of a man whose calm has jurisdiction. The boy with the bell chooses mercy over music and keeps it still. A moth hits the lens and falls spinning like a charred prayer. Sister watches, lips moving, the lullaby of order. Mac studies voltage, the steady line that says the plant will hold. He allows himself the cruel thought that keeps him useful. We can replace bulbs faster than moths can die. He requisitions an extra case anyway. The panhandle eats everything faster than doctrine admits. The scoreboard clicks like a safe. The girl counts pitches under her breath, a civilian learning the arithmetic of discipline because it serves her peace. By the 7th, English becomes a tune Vittorio can hum. He knows the strike zone to a knuckle and calls it without favour. A dust devil shoulders the baseline. Joe calls time with 2 fingers and waits it out, the field patient as a congregation in a long prayer. The wind apologises by cooling everyone's necks. By the 8th, the diamond feels less like a field and more like an oath. Town, troops and prisoners understand something they did not when the lights came on. Order can be beautiful. The radio croons a distant box score. The crowd chuckles at a joke told by a man they can barely hear. The game here decides itself with the clean logic of hands and leather. A piece of old allegiance unlatches in Vittorio's chest without bitterness. These lights are not indulgence, they are doctrine, the visible clause of a national promise. 9th inning. 2 out. A chopper dying on the infield grass. Joe charges, gloves and throws in one motion, a human assembly line solving a single problem at speed. The runner bangs first. The thud arrives an instant after the ball bites leather at the far end. Silence. Decision. Vittorio's right arm fires sideways, not up. Out. The hush breaks. The park exhales. Half cheer, half laugh. Beyond the fence, a freight horn answers, as if the depot has been listening for a cue. The lights warm the dust into a copper bloom. Hands meet along the baselines the way men shake after coming down alive. The boy pockets his bell like a harmless mine disarmed. Sister gathers the radio and leaves 1 hymn's worth of quiet behind. Mac closes his notebook with a latch's certainty. Debt paid tonight, credit extended to tomorrow. Vittorio removes the mask and feels its imprint on his face, a brand of fairness. He looks at Joe through the fence and thinks, with a shock that feels like relief. If a nation can spare electricity, leather and time for this, then the war that brought him here has already chosen its ending. Morning comes in ledger light. Mac pins a new sheet on the wall, and the paper makes a sound like a small flag. Columns run neat as ploughed rows, rations by the ton per week, gasoline by the drum, brake shoes, spark plugs, spare belts, floodlight bulbs, chalk by the crate, scorebooks by the ream. He draws a thin line and totals a column labelled athletic, as if to prove that mercy can be audited. Joe, coffee in one hand, scans the chart and grins at the pairing. Ammo and innings, he says. Same fight, different calibers. Vittorio stands beside them, cap in hand. He reads numbers the way a mason reads a wall for plumb, with his body first, then his eyes. The day's report sweeps wider. Aircraft totals across the war stack like clouds, hundreds of thousands. Tanks and armoured vehicles in the tens of thousands. Artillery in 6 figures. Trucks by the millions so plentiful that even the waste, misloads, misroutes, misplaced spares would have outstripped some enemy's total allotments. Sister hears Joe recite and smiles at his cadence. He sounds like a lector. She adds her own testimony. Clinic visits down on game nights, tempers softening, letter writing up. Grace is cheaper than repair, she says, half to herself, and writes it in the margin of her log. Mac flips to a depot summary. Average transit time from factory to post, percentage of deliveries on schedule, the float that keeps stocks from starving when rails hiccup. The language is secular, the faith absolute. Vittorio, who knows scarcity like a last name, recognizes the genius. This nation does not outrun shortages by luck. It drowns them in forethought. He remembers the impossible statistic from the radio, 1 bomber an hour at peak, a single factory's rhythm, and finds its echo in the local line items. Bulbs arriving before moths can kill them, chalk before rain erases the box, bats before the sweet spots turn to splinters. The large and the small are differently scaled proofs of the same creed. At noon, Joe briefs rookies on Geneva obligations and points at the diamond. "That is also our post," he says. "A clean game under lights reduces fights, protects the work detail, and keeps the townsfolk seeing us as law instead of force." He does not say the other truth. Baseball is the nearest thing to home they can stage without violating a single paragraph of regulation. The rookies nod. They will learn that a crisp foul line can be as preventive as a barbed wire strand. Sister escorts 2 women from town through the chapel compound. They stop at the fresco Vittorio, and the other artisans have coaxed from local pigment. The small painted loaf holds a curve suspiciously like a baseball's seam. One woman laughs softly and covers her mouth, embarrassed at delight. "You smuggled America into a sacrament," she says. "No," Sister answers, touching the plaster. "They smuggled hunger into art, and it came out looking like abundance." Afternoon brings a staff memo formalizing what the camp has already practiced. Recreation recognized as discipline enhancer, athletic kits prioritized to sustain order, chaplaincy and Red Cross cooperation encouraged at scale. It reads dry, which is how revolutions in policy should read. Mac adds a tiny check mark to the athletic column as if the paper itself will smile. Toward evening, Vittorio joins his detail at the depot. A car of tyres thumps into place. A forklift chirps. Chalk scrapes a perfect integer onto the warehouse floor for inventory count. He thinks of the opposite world, Tunisia's hooves, fuel by rumour, boxes arriving empty but for a story. Here, a number precedes every need and then arrives at the dock on time. He weighs in his palm a new ball, white and solvent clean, and feels how the stitches bite. "Some nights," Joe says over his shoulder, "I think the sound of leather on leather is the sound of a free country keeping time." As darkness folds, Mac spreads 3 charts on his desk. Production, casualties, and recreation. The first dwarfs imagination, the second demands reverence, the third surprises him still. After every grim rise in the second, he can trace an administrative act that protected the living. Better rations, precise transport, recreation scheduled to blunt the edge of captivity. The war for order is fought with coffee, ledgers, tower phones, and, yes, scoreboards. He totals the page and pins it beside yesterday's like a second star on a familiar flag. Outside, the diamond brightens, moths begin their brief war with glass, and the town gathers again, not to forget the numbers, but to understand them with their bodies. Repatriation smells like rope and steam, like canvas folded and carried away. In late 1945, the lists begin to move, and with them the men who have learned to live inside schedules. Vittorio packs a few possessions: letters, a sketch of the chapel, a scuffed ball that the quartermaster marked unserviceable and Sister marked as keepsake. Joe shakes hands at the gate and says, "Buona fortuna," with sergeant gravity. Mac signs 3 forms and pockets a broken condenser as a souvenir of a lesson learned by roadside. Sister presses a small packet of rosaries through the open bus window and blesses men who will cross the ocean twice to find home still standing on its foundations. On the platform, rumour vies with memory. Some say the hardliners will spit at those who joined Italian service units. Some fear the hunger return to Italy will swallow all goodness and leave only arguments behind. Vittorio studies his hands. remembering the feel of a regulation ball's 108 stitches and the way numbers steadied his days. He turns the thought over and finds its other face. If men can learn rules on a diamond, they can learn rules in a town. If a bat can teach patience and violence to share a handle, perhaps a country can relearn its grip. The train groans forward. Texas recedes under an honest sky. Joe walks the empty diamond and drags the infield for the last time that season, leveling footprints with the same tenderness he once saved for base paths in South Chicago. He will muster out and work nights at a plant that learned to make bombers fast and will learn to make something gentler without losing its cadence. He will carry the rulebook to a municipal league and say things like, "Keep your shoulder quiet," to boys who don't yet know why quiet matters. Mac audits war surplus with a ledgerman's sobriety. He watches crates of gloves, bats, bulbs and scorebooks go to schools and towns. He smiles at the afterlife of order. In his office, he tacks one last note to the wall. ISU labour hours tallied, dock throughput at posts with Italian units, guard incident rates down after recreation schedules formalised. The number that still pleases him most is quiet. On nights with baseball, the camp slept. He knows it is not a medal, but he suspects it saved more blood than some medals earned. Sister's clinic empties of prisoners and fills with veterans. She recognises the same injuries and the same cures. She keeps the chapel open and the lights working. On Sundays, she turns the radio low and lets a game murmur in the background, a liturgy that never quite ends. The parish children learn to keep score and to listen for the change in a crowd's breath at 2 strikes. She writes one last line in her wartime ledger. Mercy proved cheaper than repair. Both were necessary. Mercy taught repair where to begin. In Emilia-Romagna, Vittorio walks home carrying a scuffed ball and a Masaccio poster a nun gave him for the wall. Some neighbours look away. Some ask quietly about food. He opens a workshop with his father's trowel and 2 notions imported from Texas, measure twice and keep spares within reach. When someone asks what defeated him, he does not say tanks or planes first. He says schedules. They could afford to be gentle, he explains, because they never let anything run out. In time, he will tell schoolchildren about the nightlights and the boy with the bell and how a rule kept fairly can feel like a hand on your shoulder when your temper wants more. Years later, tourists will photograph the little Texas chapel and the Atterbury Sanctuary and wonder how beauty grew behind wire. Joe will read about reunions between former prisoners and former guards and nod like a man hearing a story he already knew by touch. Mac will retire and still keep ledgers for a church pantry, just smaller columns, same doctrine. Sister will be buried with a radio among the flowers. At each funeral, somewhere, a game will be finishing under lamps bright enough to read by. What the enemy learned becomes clear in archives and kitchens. Reports from German and Italian officers note morale shocks on arrival, full messes, fair rules, leisure in wartime. The ledger of mercy paid dividends after surrender, letters home softened edges a generation later. The statistic that Vittorio keeps to himself and then tells a grandson sums it. One factory once built a bomber in about an hour, and a camp once spent that same hour teaching men to love rules. The first won the war, the second taught them what to do with victory. Return to the fence line where the story began. A white arc under lamps, a clean pop in leather, a prisoner flinching at laughter and then listening for it. The camera pulls back until the diamond shrinks to a bright postage stamp on a continent of effort. Rails, roads, depots, factories, farms. Then rushes close again to show chalk dust on knuckles and a scorebook's pencilled hieroglyphs. Vittorio keeps the scuffed ball on a shelf. Joe keeps the rule book in a drawer near his glove. Mac keeps the habit of adding a reserve to every plan. Sister keeps the memory of a crowd that learned to breathe together. The lesson holds because it was embodied, not preached. Industrial democracy made itself visible at human scale, one evening at a time. Now the reckoning. The numbers stand like monuments. hundreds of thousands of aircraft across the war, artillery and armoured vehicles in six figures, trucks by the millions, turning roads into arteries, rations by the ton, moving on timetables that treated hunger like a solvable equation. Add to that the frivolous column, bats, balls, bulbs, chalk, and see how a slim ledger line bent tempers and schedules toward peace. The United States did not outfight tyranny by chance. It outplanned, outbuilt, and then outlasted it, converting production into discipline and discipline into mercy. Even casualties, terrible, sacred, were absorbed without shattering supply. The machine did not eat the soul learned to drive the machine. What survives are structures and habits. At Atterbury and Hereford, chapels remain, a fresco loaf curved like a seam, pigments mixed from soil and patience. Municipal diamonds rake smooth on Saturdays, lights come up on schedule, a child rings a bell for strikes without knowing why the sound steadies the grown-ups. Veterans teach quiet shoulders and honest pivots. Quartermasters teach church deacons how to keep a pantry stocked. Nurses turn down radios to a murmur in waiting rooms, the old cadence of innings comforting men with new scars. The language of that era, toe and ease, reorder points, mean time between failures, translates in civilian throats to calendars, budgets, and we don't run out. Historians will argue about the balance of factors, strategy, technology, alliance, luck. But the men and women who lived it leave fewer mysteries. They remember the smell of oil and coffee, the weight of a bat on the palm, the way a generator's tone deepened when the last bank of lights clicked on, the relief of a rule kept fairly by someone you once feared. Vittorio's grandson will ask whether ball games won a war and receive the truest answer. No, but they proved a nation could afford to be both strong and kind, and that proof travelled faster and farther than any leaflet. The impossible statistic, an airplane an hour at peak from one factory, will sound like myth until the boy sees a photograph of workers under a roof larger than a cathedral. Then he will believe everything else without being told. There are gaps in the record, and it is right to name them. We do not always have the box scores of guard versus prisoner games, the rosters, the play-by-play. Where memories blur, we say would have and likely. We do not invent casualties or turn kindness into policy where there was none. What we have is enough. Orders that codified recreation as discipline, ledgers that tracked bulbs like bullets, testimonies that speak simply. They treated us fairly well, and buildings that outlived the fences that once surrounded them. From those, a respectful dramatization can be built without cheating a single fact. So the arc closes. Intimate to immense, glove pop to production table, personal temper to national temperament. The diamond taught order, order taught mercy, mercy taught men to imagine a future across a fence. In that exchange, American industrial democracy showed its deepest strength. It did not just mass-produce weapons, it mass-produced tomorrow, one scheduled delivery, one calm decision, one floodlit inning at a time. As the last paragraph writes itself into darkness, imagine the lamps cooling and the moths drifting away, the infield raked smooth under stars, the depot's horn marking the hour. The guards have stacked rifles and picked up bats. The prisoners have leaned into rules and found them fair. The country has proved beyond debate that it could afford to win and to be decent while doing it.